One of the great privileges of working at History Hit and making films together with our team at Timeline is the access we get to extraordinary historical locations. Like this one, Stonehenge. I'm right in the middle of the stone circle now. It is an absolutely extraordinary place to visit. If you want to watch the documentary like the one we're producing here, go to History Hit TV. It's like Netflix for history. And if you use the code TIMELINE when you check out, you'll get a special introductory offer. See you there.
In 1926, Benito Mussolini seized power as the unchallenged dictator of Italy. He had a grand vision of creating a second Roman Empire. Throughout the late 1920s and early 30s, Mussolini's charisma and his promise to establish Italy as a world power led to his unprecedented popularity throughout the country. But he would soon find that the hazards of international politics were far greater than the challenges he faced during his rise to power within Italy. Mussolini felt that conquering Ethiopia and adding it to his collection of African colonies could be a crowning achievement. It would also send a strong message to the leading nations of the world. One secret plan to achieve his dream began in 1933. An Italian military attaché in Addis Ababa was ordered to set up consulates throughout Ethiopia. The Italians then began to smuggle chests full of silver coins into these consulates. The coins were used to bribe local Ethiopian tribal chiefs for their sworn allegiance to Italy's dictator. Meanwhile, across the border in the Italian colony of Eritrea, Italian soldiers were secretly building roads in preparation for Italy's second war with Ethiopia. As a European power back at the turn of the century, Italy came late in the game of colonial rule. In 1897, the Italian army lost 8,000 soldiers during a humiliating defeat at Adawa in their previous conflict with Ethiopia. It was the first major European army to be defeated by a colonial people. More than 30 years later, Mussolini's henchmen used the debacle as an excuse for a new war.
Some of the right-wing nationalists were still obsessed with the fact that the Italian army had been defeated by the Ethiopian army at the Battle of Adawa, and in the 1930s, the fascist propaganda machine deliberately stoked up this whole business about Ethiopia and Italy's former humiliation.
On October 3, 1935, Mussolini launched his attack. 200,000 Italian troops, backed by hundreds of aircraft and tanks, raced into Ethiopia. The Italians believed the war would have a quick end, thanks to their bribes, the secret network of roads, and overwhelming firepower. Instead, the fighting went on for months. Mussolini knew that failure might end his reign as dictator.
The Ethiopian War was a war that was supposed to be over in a few weeks. But in fact, it took more and more resources, and the Italians had to use more and more extreme measures, including the use of poison gas, to pacify the country. And they never totally pacified it.
Another hidden factor made a quick Italian victory doubtful. Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie's soldiers received thousands of rifles and machine guns from German secret agents. The weapons were courtesy of Germany's Führer, Adolf Hitler. Nazi Germany wanted to weaken Italy so it would not stand in the way of Hitler's dreams to annex neighboring Austria. After 7 long months, the Italian military forces finally prevailed. In May 1936, from the Palazzo Venezia in Rome, before a cheering crowd of 400,000, Mussolini declared the beginning of his second Roman Empire. The victory added the trophy of Ethiopia to Libya, Tunisia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland in Italy's African colonial empire. Mussolini was at the absolute height of his power and popularity with the Italian people.
We felt that Italy had much more prestige in the world. Finally, we had colonies like England and France and Spain had. And people felt very happy about and very honored to be fascist and to have a leader as Mussolini was.
Italy's future had become personified in its charismatic ruler, the man they called Il Duce, meaning the leader. His reign would become mythical.
Mussolini saw himself as the person who could make Italy into a great modern state, leading a revolution unlike anything that the world had ever seen, and that he would be a great world leader in the 20th century. This probably gave Mussolini the confidence, or the overconfidence, to think that he could join Hitler and maintain independence and maybe even to dominate Hitler.
In reality, the Italian military, weakened by the war in Ethiopia, was not ready to be considered a major force as Germany prepared for war. Mussolini's intelligence units and advisors would also prove to be incapable of uncovering Hitler's far-reaching ambitions until it was too late. These failures would lead Italy down a destructive path and put Mussolini's carefully designed myth into jeopardy as his destiny became more intertwined with that of Nazi Germany. As a young man, Mussolini was an advocate for violent change. In 1909, at age 26, he became the editor of the newspaper Il Popolo Italia, or the People of Italy.
The Popolo d'Italia was a fundamental tool for Mussolini to actually gain ascendancy in the movement, which he had certainly participated in creating, but in which he was not the leader until 1920-1921, when, after the foundation of the fascist movement as a party, Mussolini assumed his leadership.
In the social, economic, and political chaos that followed Italy after World War I, Mussolini's fascists slowly gained popularity with their anti-communist and patriotic philosophy. On October 27, 1922, Mussolini was about to ignite his own myth as Italy's savior. As the country was being pushed to the brink of civil war, members of Italy's fascist party prepared to march on Rome in a bid to take power.
The March on Rome is really the triumph of myth. The March on Rome really never happened. That's the odd part about it. About 50 or 60,000 black shirts marched toward Rome, but they stopped about 50 miles outside of Rome, and they never forced their way into the city. They never even tried to force their way into the city. The government collapsed in the face of the presumed threat and the king's fear of civil war.
Just 2 days later, in an effort to avert a bloody outcome, King Vittorio Emanuele III reluctantly appointed Mussolini the Prime Minister of Italy. When the black shirts were allowed into the city, the March on Rome became a march of triumph. Mussolini's rise to power had been secured through intimidation and coercion. It would be the first of many deceptions by Italy's new leader.
Secrets of War will continue in a moment here on the History Channel.
Together with the socialists, Benito Mussolini governed Italy under a constitutional monarchy after his rise to power in 1922. But in 1926, he declared an absolute dictatorship, in part as a result of several assassination attempts. All political parties except the fascists were banned, and Mussolini created a national secret police force known as OVRA.
Someone who was at a desk in an office who overheard an anti-Mussolini comment or a joke about Mussolini would send in a report about it and inform on someone. OVRA agents were all over, and that was part of, I think, Mussolini's intent, to have the Italian people feel that wherever they were, looking over their shoulder was an agent who could inform on them.
Often the reports turned in by OVRA agents were useless pieces of gossip. While the undercover agency had thousands of agents and informants, only 25 people were ever executed for treason in its 17-year history. But OVRA did detain over 10,000 political prisoners. One was Mussolini's biggest rival, Carlo Rosselli.
Rosselli was a socialist and one of Mussolini's most vocal opponents. Rosselli was inciting the crowds against the dictator, so he was exiled to the island of Lipari in 1928. He was dramatically rescued, whisked to France. Once he was in Paris from 28 onwards, he would more or less control his action party and their resistance against Mussolini.
Mussolini's intelligence agents continued to shadow Rosselli over the years. But for the time being, Mussolini had little to fear within Italy. The people fell for his natural flair.
He had a tremendous personality when he talked. He was electrifying. People paying so much attention to what he said and believed intensely to his word, and were so proud of all the promises that he made to the Italian people.
He was very good to the people and to me, and to us, all the kids. Let's put it this way, he was the future.
Mussolini launched a propaganda style that was geared to the masses. His designs for fascism would cut across all boundaries of society, appealing not only to the rich, but also to the lowest of the working classes.
He was a man of the people. He was a man who appeared in the fields with peasants with his shirt off. Imagine Hitler doing something like that.
Mussolini cultivated his own myth with legendary performances. His famous gestures were secretly copied from Italian cinema, especially from one of the most popular film characters of Italy, Maciste.
Yeah, Mussolini adopted some specific gestuality from Maciste. More specifically, for example, we can think about the famous posture of Mussolini when he puts his chest up and he makes his face very rigid and he rolls his eyes. Now, that was something that came very specifically from the Maciste movies.
One of Mussolini's great inventions, if you will, at self-promotion was to create a kind of a myth of himself as a sexual figure. And his propaganda machine and his official biographies all helped him to do that. So when we see Mussolini, for example, standing on the slopes of a ski resort, bare-chested in the snow, that's sending a certain message that he wants to project to the Italian people and to the world at large.
Married with 5 children, Mussolini's image was that of a devout husband and father, but in truth, Il Duce was a notorious womanizer. Despite his personal sins, Mussolini became a hero among this predominantly Catholic nation. He signed the Lateran Treaty in 1929 that formally recognized the Vatican in exchange for acceptance of the Italian state by the Church.
It was a masterstroke of compromise politically for Mussolini. He made peace with the Church. And the result is that there's a tremendous wave of support for Mussolini. It's the first great step toward popular consensus behind Mussolini, because after all, most Italians were Catholics.
Across the Atlantic, Mussolini's carefully developed image as a world leader was being recognized in the United States. Throughout the 1920s, he was admired by many Americans. The growing Italian-American community, which reached nearly 10 million by 1930, had become strongly pro-fascist. When Mussolini declared war on Ethiopia in 1935, over 1,000 Italians living in the United States volunteered to serve in Il Duce's fascist army.
After the invasion of Ethiopia, the United States placed embargoes on raw materials, including oil and copper. The Italians here in the United States responded by sending 400 tons of copper postcards to Italy to supplement the lack.
But by the late 1930s, Mussolini's international popularity would drastically change. Germany had risen from the ashes of World War I with a different kind of dictator. Adolf Hitler and his National Socialists were going to give fascism a new face. One more violent and more destructive than anything the world had ever seen. Hitler's Germany was not only going to transform Europe, but it would determine the fate of the man called Il Duce.
Secrets of War will continue in a moment here on the History Channel.
On June 14, 1934, two of Europe's most notorious dictators met for the first time in Venice. While Adolf Hitler admired his Italian mentor, his reverence did not stop the Führer from pursuing his own military agenda. Benito Mussolini's intelligence agents learned that the Nazis were plotting to overthrow the Chancellor of neighboring Austria.
The big barrier was Austria. Mussolini did not want Austria to be part of Germany. And in fact, in 1934, when the Nazis in Austria murdered the prime minister, Mussolini threatened military intervention to prevent Germany from annexing Austria, and that was successful. Hitler backed away from that because Hitler did not want to alienate Mussolini, and he wasn't ready in 1934 for a major military commitment anyway.
Despite their differences, there was a strong desire from both leaders to form an alliance. One of the most vocal proponents for Italy's affiliation with Hitler came from within Mussolini's inner circle. His name was Roberto Farinacci, a member of the Fascist Party's Grand Council. Farinacci led a growing group of Italian fascists who believed Hitler and Mussolini were natural allies. But the Italian public was far more skeptical. Nevertheless, 2 years later, in 1936, emboldened with the Italian conquest of Ethiopia, Mussolini considered an alliance with Germany. He had appointed his son-in-law, Count Galeazzo Ciano, his foreign minister, and dispatched him to Germany.
So he goes off to Berlin, and the result is the treaty which Mussolini dubs the Rome-Berlin Axis.
While the world watched the signing of a treaty uniting Germany with Italy, the actual Axis was neither a military nor a diplomatic agreement. Secretly, it was an exercise in fascist propaganda. Hitler and Mussolini had only signed a pact for an ambiguous collaboration for their common fight against communism. A true test of the new German-Italian fascist alliance came early in 1937. In Spain, a civil war against the Soviet-backed Republican government was being led by the fascist general Francisco Franco. Less than a year since his troops had fought in Ethiopia, Mussolini joined Hitler in committing his soldiers and equipment to spreading the fascist cause in Spain. Yet Mussolini's greatest challenge came not from Spain, but from France. Political rival Carlo Rosselli, living in exile in Paris, was responsible for publications and espionage designed to undermine the Mussolini regime. In 1936, Rosselli mobilized and commanded Italian resistance fighters that would challenge Mussolini's soldiers in Spain. Almost 3,500 Italians, calling themselves the Communist Garibaldi Brigade, joined the fight against Mussolini's army. Rosselli led a stunning victory over Mussolini's forces in the Battle of Guadalajara.
The presence of the Italian brigades was highly publicized. They were outnumbered by Mussolini's forces, so this was a kind of internecine battle. It was Italians against Italians, and fascists lost.
For El Duce, his defeat by Rosselli's rebel group of anti-fascist Italians was the ultimate humiliation, one that he would not forget. In June 1937, agents working for Mussolini's intelligence agency prepared to ambush Rosselli on a country road in southern France.
And one day he went for a drive in his car with his younger brother Nello in the countryside, and a car had broken down in the street in front of him. So he offered to help the man put his car together. 4 men came out of the woods, and the first one with one knife got Rosselli definitively. The brother was handled by the other 3 and received multiple wounds. They both died.
There were massive protests in France against the killings. For Mussolini, it was an international embarrassment. Much of the world had no doubt that he was behind the murders. In September 1937, Mussolini made his first visit to Germany. Hitler did his best to impress Mussolini with Germany's growing military might. The following year, in 1938, Hitler returned to Italy, where Mussolini put on a show of his own for the Führer.
Mussolini was so ill-equipped militarily that he had his formations, whether they were airplanes or ground troops, go in circles, so that Hitler thought he had 500, 600, 700 airplanes in his Air Force, whereas he only had 100. The troops were so ill-equipped, and there was so much corruption in Italy that they had cardboard shoes. It was raining, and a big puddle formed. And when the German troops went with their goose steps, they just went in a straight line. And when the Italians came after them, the troops bulged in the middle to avoid the puddle, because the Italians didn't want to get their boots wet. In retrospect, it's clear that Mussolini was not equipped as a strong ally.
Nevertheless, Hitler still pushed for a military alliance. With his country's resources almost completely drained by the Ethiopian and Spanish campaigns, Mussolini was not ready for war. But when the Germans convinced him that plans for war were years away, Mussolini saw no harm in an alliance. In May 1939, he sent his son-in-law Ciano to Germany to sign the Pact of Steel with Hitler. Each country vowed to come to the defense of the other in times of war. 3 months later, Ciano learned that the Germans were secretly planning to invade Poland in a matter of weeks. Britain and France would most certainly declare war on Germany, and with the Pact of Steel, Italy too. Mussolini was trapped by his defense treaty with Hitler. On September 1st, 1939, the Germans crossed into Poland. World War II had begun.
It catches Mussolini off guard, and it's the first major example of an undertaking by Hitler which Mussolini is kept in the dark about until the very last moment. And Mussolini resents that deeply, especially because the 2 men had agreed just months earlier that there would be no great outbreak of a general European war for at least 5 years, in time, in other words, for Mussolini to get his Italian armed forces in shape.
While Mussolini watched, the powerful German war machine was unleashed on Europe. The Italian leader was forced to take sides in a war he neither wanted nor was prepared to fight. To Mussolini, Hitler's invasion of Poland was nothing less than an act of betrayal. And for the Italian people, their love affair with Il Duce was about to come to an end.
Secrets of War will continue in a moment here on The... We now return to Secrets of War.
As war in Europe erupted in 1939, Count Ciano devised his own secret plan to keep Italy out of the fighting and save face for his father-in-law, Benito Mussolini. If Italy was obligated to fight with Germany, its army would need supplies. Ciano instructed the chiefs of the Army, Navy, and Air Force to make exaggerated lists of equipment and materials that would be necessary. Mussolini happily presented the outrageous lists to Hitler. Realizing they could never accommodate the Italian military, the Germans temporarily suspended their defense pact. Publicly, Mussolini declared Italy to be neutral.
He chose to interpret the Pact of Steel differently, saying that it meant I'll support you when I'm ready, but I'm not going to declare war. And historians say that he was seeing which side to go with.
In May 1940, while Hitler attacked and occupied Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and a large part of France, Mussolini's inner circle argued whether to side with Germany.
There is great debate within the regime, among Mussolini's henchmen, among his advisors and his ministers. There's a meeting of the Fascist Grand Council, and the sentiment seems to be to stay out. It's Mussolini's decision in the end. He's the dictator. He makes the fateful decision.
Apparently, the proud Mussolini could not let himself be upstaged by Hitler. He also feared Germany's domination over all of Europe. In June 1940, he declared war on Britain and France. Almost immediately, the war began to go poorly for Italy. Their technology was mostly obsolete. Italian Navy ships were slow and lacked radar. Italian bombers had no intercoms for communicating between crew members, often attacking their own ships by accident. When soldiers in the ill-equipped Italian infantry crossed the Alps to invade southern France, thousands were overcome by frostbite and exposure. The Italian people were saddened, shocked, and very frightened. For the first time in his political life, Mussolini's popular support began to crack at home and abroad. Italian Americans who once celebrated Mussolini began to shun him. Italian consulates in the United States were closed. While American Army intelligence units compiled lists of foreign nationals living in the U.S. who might be considered dangerous, military bases were converted into internment camps. When America entered the war, the government authorized the internment not only of Japanese Americans, but of Italian citizens as well.
My own stepfather, Dr. Giovanni Falasca, was taken the night of December 7th. He, along with other Italian nationals living in the United States, found themselves on a train and taken in the custody to Missoula, Montana, where they were to spend several years.
Despite his sinking popularity, Mussolini still grabbed world attention. He seemed determined not to let Hitler have center stage alone. In their meeting on October 4th, 1940, Hitler did not reveal his plans to occupy Romania. When the German army did so, Hitler was surprised to learn that Mussolini had suddenly invaded Greece.
He would fight his own war alongside Hitler. And so it was Mussolini who tried to get even, in a sense, with Hitler.
Mussolini's venture into Greece quickly became the latest in a series of miscalculations. By trying to keep up with Hitler, he was sacrificing his army's military proficiency for his own vanity.
The Italian army invaded from Albania into Greece, and the Greek army trapped them in the mountains. The Italians were not ready for mountain warfare or winter warfare, and Hitler had to bail them out, something that made Hitler very angry because it probably delayed his own timetable for the invasion of Russia by several months.
The delay of Hitler's Russian invasion meant that German troops had to fight through the cruel Russian winter and were stopped short of taking Moscow. It ended in a disastrous defeat from which Germany never recovered, a turning point in the war. How the outcome of World War II might have been altered if Mussolini had not invaded Greece and if the German army had reached the Russian capital before winter is a matter of historical speculation. By early 1943, while Italy was being attacked from the air by British and American bombers, the assault on the ground was about to begin. Allied troops planned to invade Italy through the island of Sicily.
The American government, and especially naval intelligence, thought that it might be useful to make contact with Sicilians, partly to have help when they arrived, partly to provide them with information, intelligence information, and so on. And they came upon this rather bizarre plan, which was to go to a man named Lucky Luciano.
Charles Lucky Luciano was one of the best-known Italian-American gangsters of the 1920s and 30s, with strong ties to the Sicilian mafia. In 1943, while Luciano was serving time in the Great Meadow Prison in upstate New York, Navy intelligence agents secretly met with him and struck a deal.
Luciano would get in touch with friends in Sicily, and in return, Luciano's sentence would eventually be lightened, and then he would be deported back to Italy after the war.
By June 1943, the American Army landed its forces on the southern Italian island. With the support of the Mafia, the first Allied invasion of Europe had begun.
Sicilian Mafia told the Americans exactly where the Germans were, what the amount of munitions were, how to get around their front lines, everything of a strategic order.
The Allies took the island in just 20 days. The next target, the Italian mainland. In Rome, not only was Mussolini's fascist dictatorship crumbling, his very life was in jeopardy. And the man who was Mussolini's biggest rival would be the only one who could save him.
Secrets of War will continue in a moment here on the History Channel. War.
While the Allies moved up the boot of Italy, Mussolini became even more dependent on his troubled alliance with Hitler for the defense of his beleaguered country. During a meeting between the two dictators in Italy on July 19, 1943, the Americans bombed Rome for the first time. It was a massive raid using 500 planes. Rome suffered many casualties. Both the Italian monarch, King Emmanuel, and Pope Pius XII went out to comfort citizens. As he toured the devastation, the influential king, who had given Mussolini his quiet support all these years, was finally convinced that the fascist leader had to go.
At this point, it was clear that Rome was going to fall. Allied forces had reached the middle of Italy, and it looked very bad. From the 19th of July forward, the royal house, in consultation with the resistance groups and dissidents within the fascist leadership, decided to have Mussolini arrested.
1 month after the Allies successfully invaded Sicily, the 28-member Grand Council of Fascists met in Rome to decide Mussolini's fate. During their 90-minute meeting, Il Duce was powerless to stop a majority of his longtime supporters from voting to remove him. Even Count Ciano chose to dismiss his father-in-law.
Mussolini was tremendously bitter at what he saw as the betrayal of all of these men who had for years been his henchmen, if you will, his advisors, the men who had risen to power with him. He saw that as betrayal, but the one act of betrayal that struck most deeply, of course, was Ciano, his daughter's husband, who voted against him.
On the morning of July 26th, Mussolini went to see the king in a desperate attempt to retain his power as dictator. The Allies managed to keep track of the unfolding drama through a network of spies planted in the Vatican and the King's Palace. It was a secret operation called the Molina Project, operated by the OSS, the U.S. Wartime Intelligence Agency. They recruited sympathetic Italians for their missions. One agent worked the switchboard at the Royal Palace.
They had an informer in the Royal Palace where Mussolini was arrested, giving a minute-by-minute account of the events that led up to the arrest of Mussolini that the Americans were following step by step.
The king is supposed to have said to Mussolini, shaking his head sadly, "I'm sorry, Duce, I'm sorry, Duce, but it's all over."
Mussolini was arrested and taken away to a secret location. When the news broke, most Italians felt a tremendous weight had been lifted.
There was widespread relief, uncertainty, fear that the man who had been at the helm, of course, for 20-some-odd years was suddenly gone, but yet relief, because most Italians assumed that with Mussolini gone, the war for Italy would come to an end.
But instead of peace, Hitler occupied the rest of Italy with his own troops. He was determined to protect Germany's southern flank against the advancing Allies. 2 months later, in September 1943, the Italian army formally surrendered to the Allies. The Allies wanted Mussolini. But Hitler was determined to find him first. Despite their rivalry, the Führer did not want his old mentor to fall into the hands of the enemy.
From the moment Hitler heard of the coup against Mussolini and his arrest, probably 2 days later, he began issuing orders for German intelligence to find Mussolini.
The Germans had an informant in the Italian Ministry of Home Affairs who revealed the secret location where Mussolini was being kept prisoner. On September 12, 1943, 75 German paratroopers and SS men in 12 gliders descended on a mountaintop in northern Italy in a silent assault. In the 4-minute raid, Mussolini was quietly rescued from his imprisonment at a ski resort without a shot being fired. He was taken to Munich. As a virtual prisoner of the Germans, Hitler appointed Mussolini to head the northern Italian states still under German control. 500 miles north of Rome, in the town of Salo, surrounded by SS guards, Mussolini led what was left of the loyal Italian fascists.
It was called the Republic of Salo, but in fact, Mussolini was a puppet of the Germans. Germany controlled all of the communication and all of the transportation, so Mussolini could do nothing really without Hitler's support.
Hitler insisted that the members of Italy's Grand Council of Fascism who voted against Mussolini be executed.
Hitler wished to make an example of these people. After all, they were traitors to the state.
Encouraged by Mussolini's steadfast fascist supporter, Roberto Farinacci, 5 members of the council were arrested, including Count Ciano.
Farinacci insisted with Hitler that Ciano be tried and executed. Some say that without Farinacci's insistence, Mussolini would have never tried his own son-in-law.
As her father looked the other way, Mussolini's daughter Edda pleaded for her husband's life. 3 days after being found guilty of treason in a Republic of Salo court, Ciano and 4 others were shot by a fascist firing squad. Mussolini ruled Salo for over a year. During that time, the first American forces entered Rome. By March 1945, with the Allies closing in, the Germans were secretly negotiating the surrender of their forces in Italy. For Mussolini, time was running out. By April 1945, Mussolini met with Italian partisans who demanded that he surrender and stand trial.
So Mussolini asks for an hour to think it over and leaves the meeting and doesn't return. He hears of a German convoy of soldiers fleeing the country and being given free passage to Switzerland by the resistance fighters. He gets aboard, but the partisans have heard about it, and there's a roadblock.
They begin to search the caravan, and one of the partisans goes into the truck and sees this figure sitting in the back with a helmet on, his head down, and says, "Arrest him."
Mussolini and his mistress Claretta Petacci were taken prisoner. They spent their last night together in the house of a peasant farmer under armed guard.